You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Weekly Wine Report. The goal of this segment is to share a mix of news, history, and stories from around the world of wine to help give you more perspective, spark curiosity, and help you discover something new in wine. I am your host, Billy Galanko, and today we have another packed show for you. We have a quick update on the Picket Fire in Napa Valley. We discuss Place de Bordeaux and the September releases, and we do a mini dive into famous ancient Roman wines based on some fascinating information I came across this week. And I'm trying to keep this as concise as possible, but I keep finding so much interesting information every time I start digging into any of these topics. So bear with me. I kept it as concise as possible, but hopefully all of the facts that I've included you guys find interesting and relevant. So let's dive right in. The first topic I want to touch on is a quick update on the Picket Fire that we had discussed last week. As of recording, it is now 100% contained. It has burned 6,819 acres, and the suspected cause has been updated. It's similar to what we had discussed last week. They're looking into smoldering ashes from a newly built outdoor fireplace on the 100-acre estate. The ashes were reportedly placed into a bucket, doused with water, and discarded after being deemed out. The interesting context, as the plot continues to thicken here, is that the incident supposedly, allegedly, coincided with the preparations for an unpermitted wedding celebration that was going to be held on the grounds. Apparently, Napa County bans weddings at wineries except for certain estates or certain permitted locations. So that would be interesting. Another wrinkle into the mix here. They'll continue to investigate and figure out what caused it. But again, this was one of the most quickly contained and best controlled fires that Napa Valley has seen recently. It did not get out of control, and it seems like very little of the grape harvest will be impacted. So that is fantastic to hear for this year's harvest. Now let's head over to Bordeaux. I wanted to talk about Place de Bordeaux today for a couple of reasons. The primary reason is that the September releases through Place de Bordeaux are coming out. But before we talk about those, I wanted to take a step back and talk about Place de Bordeaux as a whole. For those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while, you may know a little bit more about Place de Bordeaux. We've talked about the En Primeur releases for a couple of years now. We talked about the Beyond Bordeaux September releases last year. But for those of you who need a refresher, or like me, it took me a long time to actually fully grasp what Place de Bordeaux was, I wanted to share some quick tips and information. So the first bit of information or tip that if you want to sound in the know in the wine industry, Place de Bordeaux is not a place. I actually thought it was a physical place for a long time. People refer to La Place, like the plaza. In my head, there was the Place de Concorde in Paris, and I thought there was La Place de Bordeaux in Bordeaux. There is a photo that is always shared when people talk about La Place de Bordeaux, and it is La Place de la Bourse. I'm also probably saying that wrong in French, but it is home to the Palais de la Bourse, and it has a reflecting pool in the front that is really pretty. It's a beautiful building, beautiful square, but it is not the quote-unquote La Place de Bordeaux itself. And as far as I know, there is no wine business currently transacted there. It used to be the home of the Chamber of Commerce, I believe, from the sources that I've been able to find, but currently no business related to the wine industry goes on there. What La Place de Bordeaux is a wine distribution system. It was the primary way that Bordeaux got its wines out from the producers into the hands of negociants and then into the hands of merchants. There's a few steps along the way. We've covered these a little bit before, but they start with the chateau. They move on to a level called the courtier, who basically negotiate between the chateau and the negociant. The negociants are folks who negotiate with global merchants on behalf of the chateau and the courtier to distribute the wines throughout the world. So the negociants are really the people that are selling to a lot of the wine shops that you are buying En Primeur Bordeaux from, and now wines that are beyond Bordeaux. Now, what do we mean when we say beyond Bordeaux? Starting in the early 2000s, La Place de Bordeaux allowed some non-Bordeaux wines to be sold through the platform. One of the originals was Opus One, obviously with the direct connection to Bordeaux. That was a no-brainer. Another one of the oldest wines to be released through La Place that was not from Bordeaux was Malvasia. And over the years, these wines saw success. There was demand for them. So over the years, more and more wines were then sold through Le Place de Bordeaux. And why might these wines want to be sold through Le Place de Bordeaux? A lot of the top Bordeaux wines are considered some of the top wines in the whole world. So number one, there's a cachet, a prestige to be sold through the same channels that these wines are sold through. Number two, like we've mentioned earlier, it's a distribution system. There is a system through which these wines are widely distributed to every corner of the world. So all of these top wines from around other regions outside of Bordeaux are also looking for this distribution and access to get in front of customers. So that was the other main draw for each of these countries. And now, today, there's over 100 of these different Beyond Bordeaux wines released. They come from countries all over the world, including Spain, Chile, Argentina, Italy, South Africa. The list is very extensive. New Zealand, I could keep adding, but it's really exciting to see the wines get added each year, and that makes this September release even more exciting. The Beyond Bordeaux wines have 2 releases throughout the year, September and March, but most of the wines are released in this September tranche. Before we go on to talk about exactly which wines are being released this year and a couple highlights that I wanted to call out, I would like to mention Arani Global's podcast. Arani Global is a wine industry publisher. They have some really interesting articles, and they also do a podcast on very in the weeds wine industry things, but they have a multi-part series on what Le Place de Bordeaux is and how it works that they released in 2024. It's a fascinating listen. It takes a long time. There's a fair bit of episodes, but I highly recommend it. I've listened to it a couple times, and I think it's great if you really want to dive in deep and learn more about how Le Place de Bordeaux works. Moving on to the 2025 September releases, there are a wide range from throughout the world, so I'm just going to go through the list right now and call out a few notable ones from different regions. We'll start with the US. There are a number of Napa releases. Opus One's 2022 vintage is being released. That's, again, one of the wines that's been released through Le Place for the longest. That wasn't from Bordeaux originally. We have the 2022 Bailou Vineyard, Georges de la Tour. So a few really exciting wines from Napa, but I really want to focus more on some of these wines outside of Napa. I think everybody knows the big names in the world of Cabernet. Flowers, Pinot Noir is being released through Le Place for the first time. Flowers is a very cool project that focuses on really cool single vineyards and vineyard work out in Western Sonoma. Definitely worth checking them out. There is wine from Paso Robles, L'Aventure. L'Aventure, I can never say their name right because, again, it's French. So pardon my lack of French. But they're being released through the platform, which is really exciting to see Paso get a little bit of its shine. For you guys who are maybe newer to listening to the podcast, I used to work for a producer who had vineyards in Monterey and Paso here in California, and I think Paso can create some really exciting wines depending on where you are in the region. It's a really wide-ranging region, so the temperature swings and the temperatures, even in the daytime, can be vastly different depending on where you are in the region. Chile continues to add more. They've been on the forefront of this Beyond Bordeaux movement. Again, Almaviva is still there. We have the 2023 vintage being released, but then we have a few of the podcast favorites here. We have Seña being released 2023. Just this summer, we had Emily Falconer, the head winemaker who made this wine at Seña on the podcast. So I highly recommend going check that out. We also have releases this year from Clos Apalta 2022, as well as the Vic 2022 as well. So a bunch of exciting Chilean wines being released. Hopefully that'll increase the availability of these wines in your markets if they aren't already there. Moving to Argentina, we have the Nicolas Catena Zapata with Cheval de Andes and a couple other stellar wines that are coming out as well. The Nicolas Zapata is the 2022, and same with the Cheval de Andes. Next, moving over to Italy, we have Petrol Galantrona 2023 coming out. We have 2022 Massetto, as well as 2022 Solaia. We have a couple releases from BB Greats, who is this kind of funky, artistic Tuscan producer. He's releasing his Testamata 2023, as well as his Colore 2023. Now, again, that BB Greats used to release a number of wines through Le Place, and he's actually narrowed it down due to a lack of supply in some of the wines that he has and growing demand. I think more and more people are learning about BB Greats. Moving over to Spain, in Rioja, we have Tomo Rodriguez's ER coming out. I never know how to pronounce that. The YJAR, a fantastic wine coming out of Rioja. And then moving down, we go to the Southern Hemisphere again, but this time over to Australia and New Zealand. We have some fun wines coming out. We have Jim Barry's The Armagh Shiraz, which is always a fun wine. We have a bunch of Penfolds releases, including the 2021 Penfolds Grange, and a few of the others, including Saint Henri as well. We have their 2022 release of that. So that's a lot of exciting stuff coming out of Australia. Ooh, and we actually have a wine I forgot that was close to my heart, the Wynns John Riddoch 2022. This is a Coonawarra Cabernet Sauvignon. And the reason it's close to my heart is the winery that I worked at back in 2018 was located 40 minute drive from Coonawarra. The highway that I would drive on to go to Coonawarra was actually called the John Riddoch Highway. So I always thought that wine was pretty cool, and Wynns always makes a great wine. Another wine that stands out to me from my time in Australia is the Arras Grand Vintage 2015 is being released. Arras, Arras, is a sparkling wine producer in Tasmania. They make amazing wines. I brought back a ton of their wines when I came back from Australia. The wines, in my opinion, are some of the closest to Champagne-esque that I had ever tasted at the time, and still to this day, that were produced outside of Champagne. So this 2015 is their grand vintage, following kind of the old school Champagne method of releasing their vintage wines after 10 years. So I highly recommend checking out that wine, as well as some of the other, there's a couple other whites coming out of Australia, including the Jim Barry Florito Riesling, which Jim Barry always produces cool wines. And these are back vintages. The 2005 and 2015 are being released. From there, we're going to head back to Europe. There is a wide range now of French wines that aren't Bordeaux that are released through Le Plotz. I think the highlight of which this year, they come from all different regions, including the Loire Valley, Burgundy, the Rhone Valley as well. I think the highlight, in my opinion, there's actually a lot of really great wines, but I would say is the Beaucastel Hommage à Jacques Perrin. The 2023 vintage of that wine is coming out. And then also staying in Europe, we have a couple really interesting sweet wines that are being released. We have Cracker, which is pronounced Crocker as well, from Austria. This producer is renowned for their Trockenbeer and Auslesas made from different varieties. They make stunning wines. They have their Trockenbeer and Auslese made of Zweigelt, their version made of Welsh Riesling, their Grand Cuvée, and their Charube, all coming out, the 2022 vintage being released. So that's super exciting. There's also a vintage of 2021 Essentia from Tokai being released by Pajos. We're going to have a whole separate episode on Tokai and Essentia. It's a wine that I actually haven't been able to have yet, but I love the idea of how it's made. I've heard only the most incredible things about the wine. So everybody go read a little bit about Tokai Essentia. We'll have more on that in a future episode. And then last but not least, we go down to South Africa, and our friends at Klein Constantia, I can never say it right, Klein Constantia, when we had their winemaker Matt Day on earlier this summer as well, are releasing their 2022 Vin de Constance. Also, the legendary wine that they're bringing back to the forefront. Matt talks a little bit about recent vintages in that episode, so if you want to go back and listen, you can hear more there. All right, so hopefully you guys got a quick overview and a better understanding about what Le Plotz is and some of the Beyond Bordeaux wines that are being released this year. If you want to learn more about the wines that are being released, I'll put a link or two in the show notes for you to read more and see the full list of the wines that are being released. And from there, you can go talk to your local merchants and figure out how you can maybe get your hands on some of these. For today, we are now going to change gears and move over to famous ancient Roman wines. One of these is actually not necessarily Roman. I just like the story. This week, I was speaking to someone who brought up a fact about Refosco, which is one of my favorite red varieties from Slovenia, Friuli area, right there on the northern Adriatic, just right at the top of that body of water. That's where Refosco, or Refosk, if you're in Slovenia, is grown. And it's a really cool red grape. It creates wines that are just so complex. I get almost like pine, but there's also fruit and flowers, and it just has this herbaceous intensity that I love. And somebody brought it up this week, and I was like, oh, wow, I don't really hear many non-super wine nerds talking about Refosco. And then did you know that this wine was loved by the wife of a famous Roman emperor? And I did not. And I was like, I have to read more about this. So I looked into it, and this is the first wine we're going to talk about today, a famous Roman wine. And it's one that you may not have heard of. I actually hadn't heard of this one, and it's called Pucinum, or Pucinum, Pucinum. And it is made somewhere in the region of the northern Adriatic, most likely Friuli, Venezia Giulia. And it was either made of Refosco, some people claim, or Galera, which is the Prosecco grape, the grape that's used to make Prosecco. And still others say it might be Ribolla Gialla. Now, what's interesting is that this wine, when they just talk about Pucinum in the annals of history, they don't necessarily say specifics about it. But we do know somebody who really enjoyed the wine. Her name was Livia, or also Augusta Julia. She was the third wife of the Emperor Augustus. She is said to have lived between 58 BC and around 29 AD. I have, in my research, come across conflicting stories about exactly how old she was. She was somewhere, seems to be in the range of 85 to 87 when she died. And she apparently drank Pucinum every day of her life and attributed her long life to the wine. So I think that's something that's really fascinating. Some people are claiming the Pucinum name on their wines and trying to supposedly bring back the wine, even though people don't exactly know which variety was used in it and what it really tasted like. And so the debate continues. People will keep claiming that it's their grape or their wine, but I thought that was fascinating. I had never heard of that wine before and didn't realize there was so much writing about it. Now, when the person I was speaking with first mentioned that they're like, oh, this famous ancient Roman wine, I was like, oh, you're probably going to talk about Falernum, also known as Falernian. And to me, that is, and I think in even ancient Roman times, was the most famous wine out there. Falernum was grown in the hills of Campania in an area called Monte Massico. It's a volcanically rich area, and it was a strong white wine. The white wine, it could age for decades, they would say. They said years, decades, and this is in an age where wines did not age very well as a whole. The wine was said to be high alcohol, well over, some estimates are 16% at this point. Some people were saying back in the day, you could occasionally just light the fumes on fire. It was so hot in alcohol. So it's possible that during the aging process, these wines were materized, basically meaning they were oxidized and warmed up to a point and became even higher alcohol. But they are said to have aged well for decades. One of the earliest vintages actually recorded in history was a vintage of Falernian, the 121 BC vintage. That was so famous, it was talked about for hundreds of years after the event. There were people who had claimed to taste it even 100 years later. Apparently there's some around. I think that might be myth, but it was one of the earliest wines to have a specific vintage mentioned as a high quality one. And what I've always thought was interesting is not only the range of people who have mentioned it, so like Virgil's mentioned it, Horace has mentioned it, Pliny the Elder has mentioned it, but what's interesting about Falernum to me is you can still get wines that maybe it's not the exact varieties. Again, they don't know what the exact varieties are. One of them, they refer to them as Aminea Gamino vines. And some people think, and I like to think this personally, that the modern day Falangina grape produces wines that are close to Falernum. There's a couple other white varieties that are grown in the area. You can also get some cool Fiano, but whenever you have a Falangina, to me, it's a very rich, powerful white wine, and it can get high in alcohol, but it can still maintain some freshness. And it's a wine that can interestingly develop over time, especially when grown on these volcanic soils in Campania, where it's from. I like to think when I'm drinking Falangina, I'm almost drinking Falernum. I think it's neat. Everybody should go check that out. And another fun fact is Monte Massico, if you were to translate it to English, they could be called the Massicant Hills. And this is where Dan Petrosky's great-grandparents were born, and he has family roots, and that inspired the name of Massicant for his Napa Valley white blend wine. So these white blends, like Falernum, have not only inspired writers from ancient times, but they continue to inspire even modern-day winemakers today. Now, the last one I want to talk about in detail is not necessarily a Roman wine. I just think it's a really fun fact, and I've wanted to share it with folks for a while now. And it's wines made from the grape Malvasia. Now, what's cool about Malvasia is over time, the names of grapes have changed dramatically, depending on where people were in the world, what century you were in. The names for specific wines and specific grapes have changed dramatically. It has only really been in more modern times that wines were actually highlighted for their grape variety rather than the place where they're from. Over the years, a lot of people would still locally know which grape variety it was, but if it was traded, it would be generically called Burgundy or just Claret coming from Bordeaux. or just a generic name. And this kind of falls into that camp, but the name Malvasia comes from the Greek port of Monemvasia. In the medieval times, it was a common name for grapes and the wines coming from the port of Monemvasia. So this name, Malvasia, is actually one of the least changed grape names throughout the centuries, throughout actually the millennia. So I think that is fascinating personally. Whether or not all of these wines were actually made of the grape Malvasia, we do not know. A lot of these wines were coming from further eastern parts of Greece as well as Crete. But I love the idea that we're basically just saying a word that maybe people have spoken in the wine world for thousands of years. And that is our weekly wine report for this week. I hope everybody learned a little bit more about Place de Bordeaux. We discovered a little bit more about Roman wines. I don't know if you guys knew about Pucinum before, but I love that that's a story as well to go up there with Falernum. And I hope everybody was as relieved as I was to hear about the Picket Fire being contained so quickly. We will be back with our full episode on Wednesday and a 5 questions on Friday. So for now, cheers.